My name is Cristiano Rastelli, and I'm a passionate web developer and designer, in love with atomic design, CSS architecture, design system, and web components in general. I'm an eager attendee of an organizer also of technical conferences and meetup, and sometimes also speaker, as you can see today. You can find me on Twitter as IraWeb, or you can read my ramblings and thoughts on dido.net. And I work as UI engineer in the mobile web team in Badoo. It's 3.5 years now. Badoo is the largest social discovery network in the world. We have nearly 400 million users worldwide. And using Badoo, essentially people can meet, chat, and especially date. We have different teams developing the application for different platforms, iOS, Android, mobile web, and desktop web. And I work in the mobile web team, so essentially in every possible device with every possible browser. And if you want to come and work with us, with my team and also other teams, we have different open positions in London. And we have a stand in the main hall. Just pass by and say hi to my friends. And if you have any question about the talk, or you want to just have a chat with me about design systems or CSS, I'll be there after the talk. But today I'm here to tell you a story. And it's a story of war, and hopefully of peace. It's a war of words, okay, but I won't use mine, and I'll use those of the protagonist. And let's start from the war. What war? That was the question a friend of mine asked me the first time I spoke with him about this talk. Maybe I'm the only one seeing this war. Maybe it's just my personal point of view, my bubble. So I'll share with you some examples of what I mean with war, and then we can decide if this is a war or not. And everything started with the war declaration, and the war declaration was this slide. Who has seen this slide before? Please raise your hands. Oh, only Nick. This particular deck has been viewed more than 900,000 times on SpeakerDeck. Normally, one deck is some hundreds. This is the opening slides of a talk in which Christophe Chedeau, a developer in Facebook, in which he proposed a technical and methodological solution to the problem that he was facing when trying to use CSS at that kind of scale. And the solution that he proposed, and that he called CSS in JS, was a completely new, different way to style the UI elements of an application, of a web application, in React, but not only. And the thesis of his talk was that CSS has inherent problems, and that this limitation prevents CSS to work at scale. And people went completely mad on this. From that moment on, the web community was split in two by an intense debate. On one side, those who see CSS as an untouchable layer in the separation of concern paradigm, so content, presentation, and behavior. And those who simply ignored these rules, this golden rule, and found different ways to style the UI, typically applying CSS using JavaScript. This debate has become more and more intense every day, bringing division in a community that generally used to be immune to this kind of holy war. And here, the one that will follow, are some examples of comments, opinions, and reaction also, that I've collected in the last 2 years from well-known and respected members of our front-end community. Please keep in mind, this is not some kind of form of public shaming or at all. It's meant to be just a cold chronicle of what I've seen with my own eyes. And this is Jeffrey Zellman. We're talking about 2016. You will see that it's up to date. Jeffrey Zellman talking about an amnesia community that will turn the web into a wasteland of walled gardens. Ole Averroux, considering atomic CSS a joke, a language designed by assembly coders. Aaron Gustafson, that threw up a little bit after reading a blog post about the new CSS. Or CSS tricks, probably one of the most important and followed resources for CSS developers. Dismissing these new kind of techniques as just a way to try to avoid writing CSS. And this, we will see, it's a recurring theme, that people don't know CSS or they don't want to learn CSS. On the other side, things are not much better. React developers completely dismissing the arguments raised by the CSS community, labeling them as groundless, scaremongering intended only to spread fear, doubt, and uncertainty. People bashing tools and methodology. Here you can read the problem with BEM. Well, BEM, it's a tool. It can't have problem itself. Maybe it's the way that this tool is used that is wrong or not suitable for the purpose. Dave Shee, aka MezzoBlue, compared Tachyons, a functional or atomic CSS library, to the worst web dev idea of all times. Strong. Thomas Fox, looking at the separation of concerns in React, or JSX if you prefer, and thinking that everything went south. And their responses to this kind of arguments on the other side are sarcastic, like in this case, or offensive in some cases. What is this, some kind of evolutionary scale that automatically also implies value? Should I be considered some kind of primitive caveman only because I'm using SAS or LESS or BEM? Thierry Koblenz, aka CSS Mojo, on why he considers harmful the opinions of some leaders of our community. Jeff Ritzelman with a run. Key's my class name, nice pun by the way. Non-semantic class names that refer to visual styles will always be a bad idea. Always? To me it seems pretty absolutistic, no? James Kyle, declaring that web documents are dead. Well, Wikipedia. In favor, of course, of web applications. Or the classic CSS is broken saga. Now, this, the following that you will see, is really a series of articles that I've collected. Despite the titles, not all of them are against CSS, but you will get my point. So, CSS is broken. Okay. No, CSS is not broken. CSS sucks. CSS is fine, just really hard. No, CSS is broken. My dime a dozen opinion. Again, Lea Veroux, here for example. I totally understand what Vera here is trying to say, but the way she phrased it, that's the problem, a cry for help. Well, to be fair, historically, CSS in JS has never been about asking someone to solve your problems. It's been the act of someone that decided to create their own tools to solve their own problems, and later decide to share these tools as open source so that maybe others can benefit from them in some way. And in fact, these are the responses that this tweet triggered. I invite you to read all the thread. It's very interesting, to say the least, to see the kind of responses and counter-responses that it triggered. Jonathan Snook, same thing. All these also trigger a lot of back and forth between the two sides of the contention. Now, as you see, many of the tweets that I collected are 1 or 2 years old. Every time I give this talk, I say to myself, come on, this is the last time. Now things are definitely improved, they're not settled down. But then, this is what I just saw a couple of days ago. Charlie Owen, that in this long rant about CSS in JS, talks about a horror when looking at the content of the CSS in JS tag. And 2 days ago, this weekend, in this blog post, what's wrong with CSS in JS, which, by the way, I invite you to read, Brad Frost, the person that I personally admire, writes, "This makes me question whether CSS in JS advocates truly understand CSS as a language or take care to preserve hard-earned CSS best practices." Now, I don't know how you call it, but for me, this is a war. And the landscape that I see around me, well, for the CSS community is not great. But exactly, what is the matter in dispute? So what we are discussing, what they are discussing about? Essentially, there are two fronts. On one side, you have people that think that these new approaches are against the principle of separation of concern, that they are breaking the web, that they rely too much on tools, and essentially that these people don't know how to use CSS. On the other side, you have people that say that CSS has inherent problems, is flawed by nature, that cascading and inheritance are the worst of all evils, and CSS global scope is the root of every possible bad thing in CSS. And essentially, the CSS doesn't scale, and it was never meant to do it. And if you have seen the comments, probably both parts may have their own good reasons, but at the same time they're unwilling to listen to the other part's reason. So, actually, this is not the first word that we have seen, and probably will not be the last one. On the web, there's been a lot of religion wars in the last 10, 15 years of the web. Let me recall you just some of them. So, the early days of the web, I don't know who of you were there, I was there, as you see my white bird. The browser wars, Explorers versus Netscape, best viewed with on the footer of every possible web page. A few years later, dynamic HTML. People started to use JavaScript to animate pages or add the basic interactivity, and it was a scandal at that time, so that people had to write, well, maybe it's not so bad, using JavaScript in a web page. A few years later, this one was really a religious war. At that time, many were sure that Flash was going to kill the web. Well, we know how it ended, right? Steve Jobs' letter, Thoughts on Flash, was the tombstone, the beginning of the end for Flash. But then, more recent years, the first JavaScript war, the battle for the best JavaScript library, and the rise of native applications that would have killed the web, completely killed the web. Well, we know how this ended too. The second JavaScript war, the battle for the best modern framework. This one, for me, it's a very important battle, but unfortunately it's still an ongoing war. The never-ending battle for the emancipation of JavaScript and also HTML and CSS as real programming language. We are somehow also considered not a real programmers. This is still an ongoing battle. But in the last few years, no more big wars, luckily, only small scuffles here and there. Like too many frameworks, the yet another framework syndrome, the JavaScript community being accused of simply reinventing the wheel. Maybe true, but... Or too many tools, the classic JavaScript fatigue. Well, somehow this war among the JavaScript community have been put to an end by the advent of React. So, now we have seen the CSS war, and we have seen that it's not the first one. So, how there can be peace on CSS? I have a plan. And the plan is that recently I started to ask myself, why this war? What is causing it? Because I don't want to take a position. I see good reason and valid points on both sides of this kind of contention. But what I want to do is to try to understand the reason behind this war and do my part, possibly, to stop it. Because if you understand the causes, maybe you can try to find a solution or at least find the truth. So let's look at the bright side. Let's smile and look at what can bring peace. Let's start to understand what are the main causes. Well, definitely, an important role has been played by this polarization that the web has seen recently, well, recently, now it's a few years, between documents and applications. We all know that. But keep in mind that web applications are what drives our industry now. For example, think to the experience of big, surely we all know The Guardian, BBC, or Financial Times. What used to be classic document or content-oriented website are now very complex web applications that also lead and pave the way to future best practice in our industry. And many websites that we see around today are actually web applications under the hood. Also, there is a factor of an old generation of developers telling to the new generation, no kids, don't touch, this is not how you should do things, this is not how we are used to do things here. And a new generation of developers, the new cool kids on the block, waving the word modern as a flag, challenging the existing best practice, or completely ignoring the experiences and the lessons learned, if you want, and forgetting the progress achieved by the previous generation in 2 decades of web development. Well, for sure there is, for me, a misunderstanding, I would say 2 orthogonal views of what is the separation of concerns. Separation of concerns is not necessarily a separation of technologies, it's a separation of context. They're saying the same thing, but looking from 2 different angles, perspective, from 2 different points of views, and they're both valid. It depends on the context. Remember, I told you, it's the context that makes the difference. So, up to this point, I've used only the words of the protagonists of this saga, I would say. I want to give you my personal interpretation of what is the main reason behind this war. Let's take an example. The JavaScript community has solved the problem of having to deal with the global namespace ages ago. No one would argue about this one today. You would not see wars on Twitter about how to do this. But the community of CSS developers is a young community. I'm not saying CSS as technology is 20 years old. The community of CSS developers that work side by side with JavaScript developers, with designers in cross-functional teams, to build large web applications. The world of the CSS development is undergoing a metamorphosis that the JavaScript world I've seen years ago, when it was completely changed and transformed by the appearance of web-based applications, when JavaScript became a professional language, a professional development software language with its own dignity and especially business value. Standard pattern and architecture started to appear, and developers started somehow stopped to fight one against the other for the best JavaScript framework to use, but simply started to choose the right framework to use to do the job. Maybe this is what is happening to CSS too. Nowadays you have CSS developer as a specific role in a team. We have started to call us UI engineers, like software engineers. As a community, we started to discuss of CSS architecture and how to use CSS in specific contexts of web application at scales. So maybe we are just a too young community in that sense. We never had the right conversation, the right discussion about who we are and what we do. Also, another thing that gives me hope is that not everyone is willing to do a war. There are a lot of moderate people out there that don't think only with prejudice and sometimes bias, but have a more positive, constructive approach. People that it's worth to follow and listen to. I want to give you some examples. This is Max Stoiber, is the creator of Style Components, one of the most popular CSS in JS library. CSS in JS is not a campaign against CSS. Mark Dalglish, he is the co-creator of CSS modules, another popular CSS in JS library. Personally, I think he's one of the brightest minds I've ever known, a very active member of the CSS in JS community. And this particular tweet made me think a lot about how we look back at the history of the web and we think that, oh, it's a linear process. No, it's not, because this is not how evolution works. Evolution is not a linear process. Evolution is the survival of the fittest, yes, but in a specific context, in a specific moment in time. And in that sense, I love how Oliver Turner, a friend of mine, has tweaked the previous image with great irony. This is Glenn Maddern again. He's the co-creator of CSS modules with Mark Dalglish on one side and Style Components with Max Stoiber. His hope, CSS in JS creator of libraries, is that CSS in JS will not be needed anymore in the future because its ideas will be imported, will be part of the CSS specs. Especially, I think, the idea of isolation. Another person that I suggest to follow is Stu Robson, very active in the design system space and well-known speaker. He's absolutely right. Stop blaming the tools. The tools are just tools. You decide how to use it. They are not good or bad per se. It's how we use them, in which context, under which circumstances and limitation and business needs that can make a difference. Adam Nishi, I love his blog post in which he compares the web development to a chili recipe. Everyone has its own recipe of how to do a good chili. And there is no right way. Do it, enjoy your chili, and maybe share the recipe with someone else. Ben Frame, endless source of inspiration for me. Web development is not something holy, sacred, against which you can commit a cardinal sin. Chris Coyer, founder of CSS Tricks and CodePen, suggesting to avoid dogma and show empathy for people doing things differently. And finally, I suggest you to look at these two talks that were presented last year at CSS Conf EU in Berlin. By the way, one of the best conferences I've ever been, so I suggest you to check out also CSS Conf EU. They both show how much love and respect for CSS there is in the CSS in JS community, at least in the most prominent members. The first one is from Mark Dalglish, I already mentioned it, in which he proves, personally I think beyond any possible doubt, how CSS in JS is not against CSS, but it's natural evolution, the result of a convergence of different platforms and different way of writing code towards a unified world, where the code base becomes the single cross-platform source of truth. And styling, and so also CSS, plays an important role in this process of unification. And the other talk is from Glenn Maddern. In his talk, he tells the reason that led him and Max Stoiber decide to create the style components library. Mark and Glenn are two of the most prominent figures of CSS in JS, and both show how CSS in JS was born out of love for CSS, not against it. So, we have come to an end of this talk. We have seen how there is war, but there is also peace. So, this is my call for a truce. A call for me, for you, for every CSS developer and architect, for the whole community of front-end developers. But especially for you in this room today. I'm not in the position to influence or an entire community like ours, but I can try to convince you that there's a better way than fighting one each other. So these are my suggestions. The web is an ever-changing medium based on continuously evolving technology. So embrace it, embrace its nature. Be careful with the words, they can really hurt. Be pragmatic, non-dogmatic, but most of all, be curious. I leave you with these words from Lev Tolstoy. The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. So give time to the web, give time to the web and the web platform, and then usually the web will find its way and probably will win anyway against all the other platforms. Thank you.